Hello, welcome to Taxpayer Alert. I'm Al Segala. I'll be a moderator for the show. I'm also president of the Calaveras County Taxpayer Association. You know, these shows are designed to really get good information to you that you just don't find elsewhere, and this is no exception. Our guest this time is Jeremy Talcott. Jeremy is an attorney with the Pacific Legal Foundation. The Pacific Legal Foundation has been around for a while, and they take courses, cases, all the way to the Supreme Court, and they get things done. Well, Jeremy, welcome.
Al.
And let's talk about the Pacific Legal Foundation for a little bit.
Sure.
How long have you been with that outfit?
I've been with Pacific Legal Foundation for just under 2 years now. Absolutely a dream job for me. But the organization, as you mentioned, has been around for quite a bit longer. This is its 45th year of existence, so a very long and storied history.
Wow, that's interesting. What sort of success rate? I understand that you're trying to protect people's basic rights of life, liberty, and property, as it's in the Constitution, and you're trying to preserve the Constitution at the same time. Now, what sort of successes have you had at this?
Well, I'd say our best successes have been where it counts the most, which is we've had really an unprecedented string of victories, 9 victories out of our last 10 cases at the Supreme Court. We've been very good at getting cases up to the Supreme Court. We've had several just this year, cases that have gone all the way to the highest court, and as I mentioned, we've won the vast majority of those cases, many of them even in 8-0, 9-0 victories, things that you might not expect with a court that many people see as divided. But we've found ways to bring cases that do preserve these fundamental rights, and as you mentioned, we've had a lot of success in the areas of property rights and due process protections for property owners, and bring them and present them to the court in a way that makes it very obvious that property owners should win, and that they do have these protections under a Constitution that are extremely important.
You know, it seems like as a byproduct of your efforts, you're actually providing an educational service for the Supreme Court. In other words, they're learning more about the Constitution. Now, they're supposed to know it already, but sometimes they don't seem to.
Yeah, well, we're certainly trying to present the cases in a way that are faithful to what we see as kind of not necessarily strictly originalist, but in a way that is faithful to the Constitution, to the original Constitution, the ideas especially that are contained within that Constitution, which are so fundamental to human well-being.
Yeah, and also the foundation of the greatest country the world has ever seen.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's an unbelievable document that has led to more health, wealth, and prosperity than at any other time in history, I think, because it recognizes just how important individual rights and property rights are to a free and happy people.
Yeah. Now, you heard it here first. You won't see that on TV very often, but now you heard it. You live in the greatest country in the whole world. Okay. Now, you're doing a major project here. It's the Center for the Separation of Powers. The Center for Separation of Powers. That seems like a big project.
It is, and this is something that kind of naturally grew out of the work that PLF was already engaged in. We've been committed for 45 years to individual rights, property rights, and ideas of limited government.
Right.
And we realize that many of the cases that we've been bringing have a common thread, which is they are cases that have arisen under the current administrative state. And that is the fact that there is now this fourth branch of government, this alphabet soup of agencies that are passing regulations. They are going out and investigating people and fining them. They are holding what in many ways appears to be a court, but is not in a true court of law, but is instead within the agency, and fining people outlandish sums of money, ruinous sums of money. And all of it is taking place in this fourth branch that the Constitution doesn't even contemplate. So for us, it made sense to undertake this much larger project, which is what we see as the core mission for the next 45 or 50 years of PLF's existence,
right,
which is tearing down this administrative state.
Wow, that's a big job.
Yeah, it's certainly going to be a large battle. There's been about 100 years of bad precedent and slow administrative creep where these agencies have grabbed more and more power, and the three branches of government have slowly given away their own powers, even willingly, which was also something that I think the founders never could have imagined, that these branches would just give up their power to these administrators willingly. So it is going to be a huge battle, but it's one that we're extremely committed to.
Why are you doing this?
Mm-hmm. Well, as I mentioned, the administrative state, we're talking about something that now has grown to the most recent numbers I can remember off the top of my head. The Code of Federal Regulations, it's something like 242 volumes. It's 180, roughly 85,000 pages, and it's impossible. No one person could possibly know the content of all those volumes of regulations, and no one person could be expected to know them.
Wow.
And many of them are written not by elected representatives, but by unelected bureaucrats who have served for many people most of their career in an administrative agency. And we feel that that's a fundamental violation of people's due process to have these rules applied to them without going through the proper constitutional process.
Yeah, also there's no representative government with that.
Absolutely. The framers of the Constitution saw this legislative power, this ability to craft laws, as one of the most dangerous. This is something that allows officials to potentially take away people's life, liberty, or property. And they wanted that to reside with the people who are the most closely tied to the constituents they represent. And instead, most people would have no idea who passes the regulation that establishes various restrictions that they are nonetheless expected to comply with.
What do you think the basic cause of this explosion of administrative state? Mm-hmm. And before you answer that question, how would people find out more about this?
To find out more, certainly our website is probably the best resource, or a great place to find out about the work we're doing.
No, that means you have to go get your pencil. But you even if you don't have a pencil right now, we'll repeat what we tell you now, so that when you do have your pencil, you can write it down. Okay.
And that website is pacificlegal.org or .org.
Okay, pacificlegal.org. All right. Now, if you didn't have your pencil, we'll give it to you again in a little bit.
So the website is a great place to go to find information about the cases that we're already doing, and some more information about some of these kind of theories behind why we're doing this and what we think a properly limited constitutional government should be. To get to your question about why, this was a very intentional decision by the progressive eras, the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. They realized that the constitutional structure got in the way of their desire to pass a great deal of regulatory rules that would be, their conception was something that would be very responsive to changing times, that would be able to act quickly and respond to new markets, new situations. Justice Frankfurter, before he sat on the Supreme Court, when he was a law professor, actually said a rigid enforcement of the separation of powers would make this modern government impossible. So they realized that it would not be possible to do what they wanted to do if they were faithful to the Constitution. So they began advocating for the idea of a living Constitution, a document that could change with the times based on new changes within society.
So, as I understand it, presently, well, at least in intention, the basic human rights of life, liberty, and property are recognized within our Constitution. I think the 5th and 14th Amendment specify that pretty clear. Okay, so we have actually an ideology that doesn't recognize that. They're more into the common good, or the greatest good for the greatest number. I think it's one of their slogans. I think another slogan is from each according to their ability and to each according to their need. And I think that's from Karl Marx. And so this ideology, basically socialist ideology, has permeated not only our colleges and schools, but also our media. And so in order to correct that, we have to convince or influence the schools and media that there's a better way, which is the original Constitution.
That's right, and that's why the Center for Separation of Powers, even though Pacific Legal, we are at our heart litigators. That's what we love to do. We want to bring these cases, but this is a broader project than just that. This is about finding and litigating these cases. This is also about trying to make legislative changes where possible, encouraging legislation that recognizes a more core separation of powers idea, and also education. And that's the things that I'm doing, coming out talking, that many of us are going out and trying to explain just what that original core idea of separation of powers is.
There's a fellow passed away. His name is Marshall Fritz. I think he ran for office several times, and he was applying the Toastmaster principles to the concept of individual liberty. And I think he founded an organization called the Advocates for Self-Government. And he was doing exactly what you're talking about, reaching out in the community in a positive way to bring people from the other side over to our side. Well, anyways, so Marshall's no longer with us, but his work certainly is.
Yeah, and it's a huge project. You know, many people just have not heard, or even if they have, they've not really fully understood both the reason behind. And many people will hear in civics class that there's 3 branches of government: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. But many people don't understand that this was not just a convenient way to structure government. This was very intentional. And if I could quote from Federalist 51, James Madison, it's a quote that you often hear, and it's often used to justify government, which is, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. But what people often miss is the next sentence. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. But of course, government is run by men.
Yeah, that's true, yeah.
And that is the reason for the separation of powers, is this ability to constrain the natural impulses of people by pitting power against power and limiting the various powers of government to separate branches, because as also is said, most famously by Montesquieu, but the combination of all 3 powers, legislative, executive, and judicial, in one person or entity is the very definition of tyranny.
And dictatorship.
Absolutely.
And so if these principles were in place, there would not have been a Ruby Ridge or a Waco where people were murdered.
I would certainly hope. Yeah, absolutely. And that's obviously now at the 25th anniversary of Waco, that's very, very timely.
Wow.
To still be concerned about the authority of government to anytime the government is doing something that would take life and liberty, we should be at our most skeptical of the actions of government, and we should want the highest level of protections and procedural protections for individuals.
That's a big job, but it's certainly worth it. Okay, now how do we fix this administrative state?
So what our lawsuits, what we're planning to focus on is some core principles. And these are what we see as the kind of major violations of separation of powers. There's the horizontal separation of powers, which is the 3 branches of federal government, and there's also vertical separation of powers, which is this concept of federalism in the 10th Amendment, that any powers not expressly given to the federal government or prohibited to the states are reserved to the states and the people.
Right.
And so for us, we're going to be going after what we see as the major violations. And for horizontal separation of powers, what we see is delegation, deference, and due process. These are 3, either principles or kind of doctrines that can protect that separation of powers. Delegation is when the legislature tries to give its power to write laws to the executive, for example. That's kind of the most famous one. It's very interesting. That's a doctrine that the court has long discussed, but there have been no cases that have struck down delegation since 1935. But just this year, the Supreme Court took a new case that expressly deals with this issue. So it's very possible that in the next term we'll see some hopefully revitalization of this doctrine, which would mean that only the legislature gets to write laws and the executive can't. That would be huge.
Now, does the PLF have a case for that?
This is not a PLF-involved case. It's very interesting.
It ought to be.
I know. We will certainly be weighing in. We will be filing a supporting brief, I believe, in this case because this is such a huge issue that we care very deeply about. The second issue I mentioned was deference, and that is these days when a case originates in an administrative agency, let's say you as a business get fined by the SEC, you want to get a judge to look at whether or not what the SEC did was correct. When you get in court, the odds are already heavily stacked against you because there are these judge-created doctrines that they will defer to both interpretations of law and findings of fact by the agency itself. So that means unless the agency's interpretation of a law is essentially completely unreasonable, the judge will adopt that reasoning, even if they might have made a different determination if they had approached the problem themselves. Secondly, with facts, unless facts are essentially completely unsupported by the record, they will defer and assume those facts to be true. Makes it a very uphill battle once you get to court. So we're going to try and, this is, it is, as Justice Marshall said, it's emphatically the duty and province of the courts to say what the law is, not to allow an agency to tell them what the law is.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and then as I said, the third issue on horizontal separation of powers is due process, where it shouldn't matter. We believe that there should be no kind of judging going on outside of the courts, but to the extent that any agency or the executive tries to take away your life, liberty, and property, you should have due process protections. And these days, it's very common for an administrative agency to issue subpoenas, to call, take evidence, and to force you, again using the SEC as an example, to force you to turn over documents even if they don't have any sort of probable cause. They can just demand it, and you don't have the same due process protections that you would have had in court. So we're going to try and strengthen those due process doctrines and extend them, and then hopefully eventually bring everything back within the Article 3 courts when the federal government tries to go after individuals.
Well, we have a little bit of that going on right now with I don't know if it's prosecution, but they raided the attorney for Donald Trump, and to attempt to get all the communications that he's done, and then force him to testify. I understand now he's taken the fifth, but I wonder, since that was done by the FBI, which is under itself investigation for doing things not right, if this is nothing more than politics.
Certainly possible, and I have, I don't know enough to comment on what sort of information the FBI would have.
Well, all I know is the news.
right, and but the point is, what is interesting is, presumably, if the FBI did go, regardless of what their information was, they had to at least present that to a judge to get to say we have some sort of probable cause. There's a whole other conversation about how often the courts demand true supporting evidence and whether they're too quick to kind of accept statements by law enforcement and issue those warrants. But at least there's some sort of due process that's provided. And again, on the other hand, had an administrative agency wanted to seize those records, they might not have needed any sort of probable cause whatsoever. They could just demand financial records, and a person would be required to give them, even though there's no neutral third party agreeing that there's at least enough reason to potentially seek that information.
Okay, so there is the Fifth Amendment where a person can't be compelled to testify against himself, but that Fifth Amendment doesn't extend to his writings and his personal property. They can be seized.
Yeah, and especially in these administrative agencies, those due process rights are just seen as there is still some due process protections, but what the judges will often say is just the amount of process that is due, and that's when they're reviewing these administrative proceedings. The judges have many times over determined that process that is due is much less than what's required in a criminal proceeding. So in the same time period where many due process protections, the court extended them within criminal proceedings, they have simultaneously signed off on reductions of those so long as it's property being taken through an administrative federal agency.
Well, this is all under the title of how do we fix it. So, so I think what you're saying. Oh, by the way, what is the website? Do you have your pencil ready?
So again, that website is pacificlegal.org.
Pacificlegal.org. Okay.
Yeah. And as far as how to fix it, again, the things that we're hoping to do is educate, get out and talk about this, discuss what the original understanding of limited constitutional government is and what it should be. We plan to seek where we can to make legislative reforms wherever we'll support those in whatever ways we can, whether it's helping write or review. We'd love to get involved in that. And then finally, of course, our core mission, we're going to go out and find the cases that we think will help us to get our foot in the door and start striking down some of these, what we see as very unconstitutional actions. So your primary effort is in litigation, not education. All right, so in order to get real progress, you have to also balance it with education. And I'm wondering what is being done in that area. Are there other groups that are working on that? Absolutely. There's, there are, I would say, in terms of the law, for example, the Federalist Society, which many people may have heard of, is a group that also, their main mission is discussion and kind of engaging the conversations that lead to then the types of lawsuits that we bring. There's also many think tanks such as Cato and Heritage in D.C. who are similarly doing the research and a lot of times the scholarly writing that helps us back up the claims that we're making or starts to perhaps make judges and other lawyers receptive to those arguments, which is another prong in the battle.
I think another one is Judicial Watch.
Absolutely, yeah.
I subscribe to them. They're always asking for more money. But it's for a good cause.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, so with your successes in litigation, combined with the educational work of these different organizations, there's a real possibility that we could save our constitutional republic over time.
That's certainly the hope. And, we have filed a few cases recently under our new Center for Separation of Powers project. And these are cases that, again, we're trying to slowly start to get the courts to enforce the constitutional provisions as they're actually written. And as they start to enforce these constitutional provisions, it will make it more and more apparent just how unconstitutional the administrative state is.
Yeah. The probably at some point the voter is going to wake up to this, and perhaps many voters already have, and in spite of the media.
I certainly hope so. I think that this is an area that everyone should care about, because no one at this point is free from the specter of prosecution or some other sort of enforcement, civil enforcement, under the administrative state. It is, as I mentioned, it is functionally impossible. And I'll throw another Federalist quote from James Madison in I believe it was Federalist 62, said that once the rules are so voluminous that they cannot be read, or so incoherent that they cannot be understood, it will be to no avail of the public. So essentially, once there's too many rules for anyone to know, or they're written in ways that the average person can't understand,
we're there now.
Which is exactly where we're at now. Everyone, and there's I've lost the name of the author, but there's a book called 3 Felonies a Day, which posits that every single person commits 3 felonies a day, because there are so many laws that if we were followed closely, if you paid attention to every single thing we do, we could all be convicted of something.
Wow. There's a little book I read back in 1964. It's the author's name was Frederick Bustier, and the name of the book is The Law. That is a fascinating book. The Law by Bustier. Google it. and Bustier spelled Bastiat. It's a French word.
Yeah.
Now we have a couple of minutes. What is some of the initial CSP cases?
Yeah. So our big initial launch, we filed cases in several circuits simultaneously. Kind of unprecedented what we've tried to do here, which is essentially filing the same cause of action in multiple locations to try and force multiple courts to grapple with the same problem. And what we've looked at is the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, passed a regulation that treats vaping, if you're familiar with the e-cigarette, they've now treated that as if it's tobacco, and they've written a regulation that says
we're out of time.
Oh, fantastic.
And we appreciate it having you, and thank you for watching Taxpayer Alert. See you next time.